I'm going to have a seat.
It's good to see everyone. I'm 2 weeks in the job, and I'm getting to meet so many wonderful members of this community and all of the history enthusiasts in Carroll County. Talk louder? How's this? Better.
Yeah.
Well, Kevin is no stranger to giving presentations for the Historical Society. In the past, his presentations have included box lunch talks celebrating 250 years of Westminster, Maryland history, celebrating the history of Bell Grove Square, Come Loose Your Head over the history of Oddfellows Hall, and Murder and Mayhem in Carroll County. You still hear me? In January 2016, his presentation for the annual Historical Society birthday celebration was on the life and times of Colonel John Kleinhoff Longwell, a newspaper publisher and advocate for the creation of Carroll County in January 1837. And just this past January, he gave the annual Carroll County birthday talk on the legacy of the Six Nations. Kevin has been a self-employed artist, writer, and farmer since 1974. He served in the U.S. Marine Corps Reserves from 1971 to 1973. He served as the mayor of Westminster from 2001 to 2005. He recently rejoined the Westminster Common Council as council member in May 2019. Since 2004, he's written for a number of national and local publications, including the Baltimore Sun. He currently writes for the Carroll County Times. The Maryland Delaware DC Press Association awarded him an editorial award in 2009 and a religion reporting award in 2017. Kevin served in the civil rights movement in the South in the early 1970s. He is currently an officer of the Carroll County branch of NAACP. He served as a police, fire, and military chaplain for many years. Although his ancestors were historically Quakers, he was raised in the United Methodist Church. Since 1998, he has been an active member of the Grace Lutheran Church. He served on the Grace Lutheran Church Council from 2012 to 2018 and recently rejoined the church council. His family's lived in Carroll County area since the 1600s. He was born and raised in Westminster and lives in Westminster, Maryland with his wife, Caroline. And I'm happy to have Kevin here. Please help me welcome him for Here Come the Lutherans.
Yeah, I always like to say I live in Westminster with my wife, Caroline. Pray for her.
We do.
So, in 2015, there were 24 Lutheran churches in Carroll County. Although much more research is needed, except for isolated articles by historians John Baumgartner, Joe Getty, Jay Graybeal, and Mary Ann Ashcroft, I have yet to find a uniform, codified, coordinated, and comprehensive history of the Lutheran Church in Carroll County. So this topic is a work in progress as I talked with a number of you before the meeting. And bear in mind that I often like to write linear history, but this history is not best explained as a linear history, but rather it's best explained as an interwoven puzzle quilt. A previous version of this presentation was shared at a meeting of the Westminster Cluster at St. Mark's Lutheran Church in Hampstead on Monday, May 11th, 2015. So it's been fairly thoroughly vetted, although I did talk with a couple of folks before the presentation this evening. There's a number of folks in here that very well may know this history better than I do. But those folks really knew Lutheran history, and it was a pleasure to give this presentation. I've modified it, I've added to it since then. I've also been able to find some references to the Lutheran Church in Carroll County in my high school classmate Nancy Warner's book, or on the history of Carroll County. That's much better. I've also found a number of historical accounts of some of the individual churches in the county. Hopefully this will continue as a collaborative project to be later assembled into one body of work. As a matter of fact, I picked up some work already this morning from Lee, and thank you, Lee. I really appreciate that. So at this point today, where I would like to begin is with some historic context of the church's beginnings in the county. Faith has always been an important part of life in Carroll County. Throughout Carroll County's history, houses of worship have played an important role in the county. The early settlers of Carroll County were initially attracted to this area by the relative ease of obtaining land and the religious freedoms that were afforded Marylanders. The prized possessions of many of the earliest Carroll Countians were a Bible, a hymnal, and a prayer book, according to a history by my high school classmate Nancy Warner. Quaker, Brethren, Lutheran, and Methodist congregations were all established in the county before 1770. Westminster was certainly no different. It's not a surprise that when the early settlers first came to Westminster, to the Westminster area, one of their first priorities was to construct a union meeting house that was used by various religions observed by our community's pioneers, especially the Lutheran and Methodist denominations. And I think I was talking with Lee earlier before the presentation, but I was talking with you earlier. That's the only anomaly that I'm aware of. Most of the Union churches were the Lutheran and the German Reformed. But in this case, with the Westminster Union Meeting House, it was shared by the Methodists and the Lutherans. But it was also a house of government, and I'll get to that in a minute. Westminster was certainly no different. Let's see where we are. Observed by our community pioneers, especially the Lutheran and Methodist denominations. Interestingly enough, and follow along with me, interestingly enough, the tradition of the community coming together at the Union Meeting House continues until this very day. On every Memorial Day since the year 1868, the community still gathers at where the Union Meeting House was once located, at the large urn located on the knoll, immediately in view as one enters the historic Westminster Cemetery from Church Street. As the early settlers came together as a community in 1764, one of the first focal points was the Union Meeting House of Westminster, and that tradition continues to this day. It is important, I've had that question before, why does the Memorial Day Parade end at the Westminster Cemetery? And it's because of the Union Meeting House. That was the house of government also in Carroll County and the town of Westminster before government was formed April 5th, 1819. And I think I get to that here in a second. Yeah. It is important to note that the Board of Trustees of the Union Meeting House concurrently served as a de facto government for the early settlers of the Westminster and Carroll County area until the town of Westminster was incorporated on February the 5th, 1819. And they held, interestingly enough, for the Board of Trustees for the Union Meeting House, which was the form of government at that time, they had elections every year. Can you only imagine? Some historians think that the Union Meeting House was first a log structure that was constructed around 1890. However, there are numerous references in a number of reference books that there was a structure there as early as 1760, 4 years before the town's founder, William Winchester, drew a plat plan for what we know today as Westminster. Construction of the brick Union Meeting House began in 1800. It was completed in 1811. The book, Carroll County Cemeteries, notes that in 1808, the Union Meeting House was still incomplete because records show local residents were granted permission for a lottery from the Maryland General Assembly to raise funds to purchase a fire engine and to complete the church. Sadly, the building was purchased in 1891 and demolished by Dr. Charles Billingsley. The bricks were reused in constructing a storehouse for canned goods at the cannery of Smith, Yingling and Company. And that was located where the Sherwood Distillery is currently located today. Carroll County's first settlers were predominantly Germans and Scotch-Irish who moved to the northern part of the county from southern Pennsylvania. In this period, the issue of immigrants coming from these two bordering colonies, Germans from the north, Scotch from the west, and the Irish from the south, was of grave concern. Research for the Historical Society of Carroll County by Mary Ann Ashcraft indicates as 18th century German immigrants moved south and west from the east coast ports where they landed, they brought along their religious preferences, whether Protestant or Catholic. Carroll County is strongly influenced by the German Baptists, also known as Dunkards, and later known as the Church of the Brethren. Another strong influence came from two denominations that worked very closely together in those early years, the Lutheran and the Reformed, now known as the United Church of Christ. And a 1967 history of Grace Lutheran Church reports, in tracing Lutheranism in Maryland, we must refer back to the years 1747 and 1748, when a small number of Lutherans and German reformers met and held services in members' homes. According to the Grace Lutheran account, history relates nothing further of Lutheranism in Westminster from the early 1740s until November 14, 1842. At that time, the pastor of Manchester, let me see, what was his name? His name was the Reverend Philip Willard. At that time, he organized a Mission Lutheran congregation in Westminster. Earlier in the year, when the Synod had met in Frederick in 1842, it formed a new pastoral district of Tawnytown, Manchester, Silver Run, Winters, and Westminster to be called the Westminster Charge. On May 9th, 1863, and if you can only imagine, in the middle of the Civil War, right before the Battle of Gettysburg, on May 9th, 1863, a call was extended to Reverend H.C. Holloway, who at the time was a student at the Gettysburg Theological Seminary. His salary was $500 a year. A parsonage, believed to have been located on Pennsylvania Avenue, was made available. At the time, the congregation met at the West End School, and building a church was the focus of a great deal of discussion. After 2 years of agitation and persistent effort on behalf of a fund to erect a church in Westminster, Reverend Holloway's efforts were rewarded. The cornerstone for the church was placed on August the 5th, 1866. According to a church history, the wisdom of the location of Grace Church can be seen in light of two facts. First, there was no church in the west end of town, and second, the town was rapidly expanding to the west. When Grace Church was built, there were only 3 houses between the railroad and Carroll Street. After setbacks, trials, and tribulations, the church building was dedicated on February the 23rd, 1868, only to be destroyed 15 years later in the Great Westminster Fire on April the 9th, 1883. Replacing the church began immediately and was completed at a cost of $17,000. Meanwhile, back in the 1700s, in the less populated areas of Maryland, the two groups, Lutheran and Reformed, established union churches. We talked about that before the meeting, before the presentation. They established union churches with services held by both faiths at different times. And that's according to a history by Mary Ann Ashcroft.
This pattern can be seen throughout the northern and western parts of present-day Carroll County, where Pennsylvania Germans settled in significant numbers. And that would be in Tawnytown, Uniontown, Manchester, Silver Run, and Westminster. Indeed, the German language remained a predominant language for a large majority of northern Carroll Countyans well into the mid-1800s, or as late as the 1930s, according to local folklore, especially in the Carroll County churches. I don't want to go too much off script because I've got a lot to cover, but one of the reasons why it took 50 years to form Carroll County, finally in 1837, is the Germans didn't want to have any parts of dealing with the English. They considered the English to be spendthrifts, and that's why the elections failed over and over again to form Carroll County. English was the language of the southern Carroll Countyans. Westminster remained, and stop and think about this for a moment, Westminster remained at the confluence of the three main cultural influences in a role sort of like Switzerland. We were Westminster was the demilitarized zone in those days. After the election of 1833, in which the election was to form Carroll County, Manchester actually hoisted cannons up probably near where Westminster Avenue, Westminster Street and Park Avenue are located, on top of the hill, and fired cannons at Westminster. Yeah, and you think elections these days are tough. Having said all of this, the Westminster Union Meeting House is not accepted to be the first church built in Carroll County. It is currently believed that the first church building in Carroll County was erected by the Lutheran and Reformed congregations of Manchester in 1760. Again, there can be no doubt that religion served as the basic building block for the foundation of government and a greater sense of community in Carroll County, and we enjoy those benefits of the work of the early religious community to this very day. For some additional context on the history of the church, and this is really important, for some additional context, before 1744, the government of what we know today as Carroll County was that of the Algonquin Iroquois nation. Long forgotten in many studies of American and Carroll County history is that the Iroquois played an important role in the evolution of American democracy. Much of our current way of life is owed not only to the early religious community in Carroll County, but also to the heritage and the legacy of the Iroquois nation. A number of the main roads in Carroll County have their beginnings as trading routes used by the Iroquois. Several towns in Carroll County where the churches were later established, Patapsco, for example, had their beginnings as Iroquois settlements. Another often ignored dynamic is that Carroll County was the subject of a much larger dispute between two world powers, France and England. It was also the focus of the dispute between two governments, the proprietary colony of Lord Baltimore, Maryland, and the Iroquois nation. As a result, Europeans came to the Carroll County area very slowly at first, and it was not until the Treaty of Six Nations was signed with the Iroquois on July the 4th, 1744, and the dispute over the Mason-Dixon line was settled in 1767, that settlers started to come to the Carroll County area in greater numbers and form churches. Not to be overlooked, the resolution of the boundary line dispute kept folks from being taxed by both the Pennsylvania government and the Maryland government. A bit off script. Even to this day, there is a preoccupation in Carroll County with law and order and public safety issues. That is because when folks first started coming to Carroll County, it came as a result of Carroll County being advertised that it was safe. It was safe to come to Carroll County. Establishing churches in Carroll County was greatly limited throughout much of the 1700s because the area was perceived to not be safe for settlers until after the treaty with the Iroquois nation was signed in 1744, and perhaps more importantly, the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763, ending the French and Indian War. The Treaty of Paris signaled the end of the North American portion of a global war between France and England. It was one of the last pieces of the puzzle making settlement in Carroll County and the establishment of churches in the area with relative freedom from violence. The last piece, of course, was the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, which left much of the country economically impaired. So it is at this juncture in history that it is believed that the first church building in Carroll County was erected by the Lutheran and Reformed congregations of Manchester in 1760. This is supported by the work of Warner, who reports, the first church building in Carroll County was erected by the Lutheran and Reformed congregations of Manchester in 1760 on a tract of land called Old German Church, patented in 1758. A history of Manchester published on the town's website agrees. A Lutheran church was erected in Manchester in 1760 as the first place of worship in Carroll County. A subsequent structure was the Emmanuel Evangelical Lutheran Church, which was founded in 1862 and located on Church Street. A large white oak, older than the church, stands beside it, and the large oak is considered to be the town symbol and the town tree. Throughout the county, according to Warner, the Lutherans and the Reformers worshiped together and shared common structures in what we know today as union churches. It was a labor and cost-saving necessity in the early years. They finally built separate churches in the decades after the Civil War. Next comes St. Benjamin's and Crider's Church, organized in 1761 just north of Westminster, the second oldest Lutheran and Reformed church in the county. According to Warner, the congregation of St. Benjamin's, or Crider's Church, was organized in 1761 just north of Westminster. 2 years later, this group built the second oldest Lutheran and Reformed church in the county on land donated by Mr. Crider. This is also supported by research by Ashcraft, who adds, today's church, built in 1890 to 91, has been modified a number of times. It replaced a brick structure built in the first decade of the 19th century, which replaced the original 1763 log church constructed on land donated by Mr. Crider. Like many other Lutheran churches in Carroll County, St. Benjamin's began as a union church where both Lutheran and German Reformed congregations worshipped, usually on alternate Sundays. I thought that was kind of fascinating. So you went to church every other Sunday. During the late 19th century, many union churches split and built separate churches for each denomination. Next is St. Mary's in Silver Run. St. Mary's in Silver Run was built in 1763. According to Warner, the original log structure for St. Mary's Lutheran Church was built in 1763, and it was replaced by brick in 1822. Next is in Bachman's Valley. The Lutheran and Reformed Church was first called Bowers in the 1770s after the landowner. Then it was called Bachman's. Then it was called Jerusalem. Next up is St. Luke's Winters Lutheran Church, just outside of New Windsor. It is the 5th oldest Lutheran church in what we now know today as Carroll County. According to a church history written by Betty Munschauer, the church's historian emeritus, which appears on the church website. Munchauer reports that the books at the Gettysburg Lutheran Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania state that the Winters Church was organized as the Evangelical Lutheran Winters Church in 1783. Our first evidence of the name St. Luke's Winters Lutheran Church was in the subsequent Articles of Incorporation of March 30th, 1856. It is believed that some of the earlier settlers in New Windsor worshipped in homes and groves long before St. Luke's Winters Lutheran Church was organized. It has also been recorded that as early as 1766, George Francis Winter, who was one of the earliest settlers near the town of New Windsor, received an application from German colonists in Pennsylvania for land for the erection of a prospective Lutheran church and for land for farming purposes. It has been stated by historians that a log church was erected in 1772. On March the 30th, 1856, the church was incorporated under the name of St. Luke's Winters Lutheran Church. Most of the first members, communicants of our church, were German immigrants. The old register at Gettysburg is in German, as well as many of the old tombstones in the cemetery. Next up is a log church called Bost, or Emmanuel, was built between Westminster and Taneytown before 1794. It was replaced by a brick building in 1815. Another interesting aside, a lot of folks don't realize that the church was the first government in the area. Another interesting fact is, to answer another question that I've been asked after this presentation, is why do the early schoolhouses often look like churches? And according to Nancy Warner, the Lutheran and Reformed congregations in Manchester established the first church in Carroll County, established the first school in Carroll County in 1762 in a separate building at the northern end of Manchester. Fire destroyed the original building in 1813 and it was replaced by a brick building. The pastors at the school conducted examinations to determine the schoolmaster's knowledge of faith and the Holy Scriptures. The Quakers of Pipe Creek Meeting House had a school with a reputation as one of the best in the region. Union churches throughout the county were used as schools, according to Ashcroft. And that's how my family came to Maryland. My family, the Warfields and the Wrights in particular, participated in the English Civil War in the 1600s. And as a result, King William said, "Where would you like to go?" And he first sent the family to Ireland. The family later came back to King William and said, "What's second prize?" And he sent, at that time, the Wrights, W-R-I-G-H-T, were Quakers. And we were sent, the family was sent, my ancestors were sent to the Friends Meeting House School in the Union Bridge, New Windsor area. The family later intermarried with the Methodists when we intermarried with the Warfield family, and so we switched teams. We went from the Quaker team to the Methodist team. And this is, I found this to be a really interesting piece of historic trivia, that Joseph M. Parks was the first principal of the Manchester Academy and received the salary of $200 a year. He later became a prominent lawyer in Westminster and a member of the House of Delegates. His son, probably one of the most eminent jurists in Maryland, Francis Neal Park, 1871 to 1955, carried on his dad's legacy and played a role in a little-known connection in Westminster's American Civil War experience. Judge Park's uncles from downtown Westminster, where the Boys and Girls Club is currently located, that was the Neal House. His uncles, Henry S. and Francis Neal, fought for the Confederacy during the American Civil War and played a role in the Battle of Gettysburg. This completes a full circle all the way back to the urn, just as the community to this very day comes back all the way full circle to the Westminster Cemetery every year at the end of May, as it has ever since 1760 and 1868. So now you get to play Stump the Historian. Are there any questions? I love questions. Please bring them on. That was a lot to cover. Yes, ma'am. The nice young lady in the red sweater.
Well, while I was doing research for Elizabeth Sherman for the BLT in September, I found a real interesting little tidbit about German Lutheran history, and that is that St. Ben's, their first English was confirmation class, which makes sense because the young people are probably, picking up English. Have you found any kind of references to how English was incorporated into these early churches?
Because the question is have I found any references to how English was incorporated into the education at the churches? That's because that's because English was becoming the predominant language of the Carroll County area. I remember quite a number of years ago, there was an initiative up in the Tawnytown area to make English first. And when I asked them about it, I said, why English? And they said, well, that's the language. We need to speak the language of our forefathers, of our ancestors. And I said, well, that would be German. And I got permission from my editor to write half the article in Spanish. There was a lot of folks do not realize the predominant language in Carroll County and up and through the late 1800s was German. And the church, recognizing that English was becoming spoken in the rest of Maryland, started teaching English classes. I have seen that reference before. More questions, please. I love questions. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any idea why the same church chose to build, to my way of reckoning, way outside of town?
Grace Lutheran Church?
No, I'm sorry, Crichton's.
You got me stumped. I don't know why. I mean, because Grace Lutheran Church, when it was built, was way outside of town too. I mean, so was McDaniel Western Maryland College, was way outside of town. But Crider's, why Crider's?
Maybe it was populated by a lot of farms. Farms were big families.
I don't know if I articulated it well enough, but many of the churches were located on the Algonquin Native American trails. But heck fire, there's no trail up there nearby. So I'm not sure I know the answer to that.
I always felt it's because they were cheap and they got the land for free. Literally.
Mr. Crider gave it. Well, that's interesting. A lot of the answers are economic like that. Yeah, I don't know. They didn't want to come into town?
Well, too far in those days.
It was way far. I mean, you ever wonder why it is that Manchester is 10 miles from Westminster, and Hampstead is 10 miles from Westminster, and Tawnytown is 10 miles from Westminster, and Mount Airy is 10 miles from Westminster? I mean, that was how far you could walk with an oxen cart in a day in those days. So, I mean, in those days, from Crider's to Westminster was a half a day's trail, easily. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Do you have any idea how long services continue to be conducted in German in the Lutheran churches in the area? I know that for a good while they still preached and had their services conducted in German, but about when did that switch to English?
According to urban tradition, many of them, German was still incorporated in the services up until the 1930s, but that's according to oral tradition. And if you say that publicly, there's always the person that said, well, English was always used in my church since the 1800s, and that could very well be. There was always a German dynamic in the services, at least up through the Great Depression. World War I put a dent in that a little bit. There were a number of streets in Carroll County that had German names, and they actually changed the names during World War I. I guess that was a bit awkward, but according to oral tradition, as late as the 1930s, and you can see it in the minutes in some of the old churches also. The minutes were kept in German. More questions, please. This is where I learned. John, and a lot of this presentation, a lot of this I learned from John. Thank you, John. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's kind of a trivial question, but you mentioned this family, prominent family. They were jurists. I've never heard that term before. Is that like an archaic name for a lawyer? A jurist.
Yeah, Jurist. Francis Park Neal was a very famous jurist. He was a judge. He was a judge. I have too many friends that are attorneys. Yeah, he was actually on the Maryland Court of Appeals, which is considered to be the Maryland Supreme Court. But he was from, and Judge Getty is now on that court. There is a very, very rich tradition of prominent judges, jurists, coming from Carroll County. And why did they first come to Carroll County? One of the reasons they first came to Carroll County was the railroad. Willis Street was the first houses on many on Willis Street behind the courthouse. They were all the homes of the railroad lawyers. It only took, how many years did it take to get the railroad to Westminster? Was it 15 years? You think things move slowly these days. Yes, sir.
I went on the historical, the houses of worship tour that we had a couple of weeks ago. That was really great, by the way. But anyway, they talked also about the Germans coming from the north, from Pennsylvania. So I was wondering, why were there so many Germans settling in Pennsylvania? It's not a Maryland thing, but I was wondering if you knew why so many Germans went to Pennsylvania in the first place.
I've known that answer in the past. I don't know that answer as I speak. It is actually Delegate Yingling wrote about that. Do you have the answer, Kristen?
Well, not exactly. The closest thing I have is that the Germans were coming from the Palatine region of Germany,
yeah, right.
which was going through a lot of upheaval and internal wars and stuff among the city-states or the principalities there. And so people were flooding in through Philadelphia, up through Lancaster, and then sort of hitting this wall of the French and Indian War. Even Washington reported there were only 2 farmsteads at the end of the French and Indian War between Frederick and here, because the war was so violent with the French and Indian War, and we think of that as somewhere else out west. But it was right here.
It was in Carroll County. Carroll County was considered to be extremely dangerous because of the French and Indian War and because of the conflict with the Native Americans. And you hardly read about it these days, but that is why. If Carroll County is not safe enough to build a house, heck fire, you're not going to build a church. And that's why it's prominently mentioned in a lot of the history of this. But the French and also, as an historian, I write and read a lot about the various wars over the years. And I was taught about a lot of the various wars in the Marine Corps. The French and Indian War was horrific. It was absolutely horrific. It was extremely expensive. It bankrupted much of the world. It definitely bankrupted much of the colonies. It led directly to the American Revolution because England was bankrupt. The Netherlands, the Dutch, stopped lending money to the English. in an effort to stop the war, because the war was horrible.
Well, when that great wall of violence was lifted at the end of the French and Indian War, you had a pent-up bunch of people up in the Lancaster area.
Yeah.
And the thing about coming down to Westminster was that we're just south enough to be away from the border wars of Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And as Kevin mentioned, you don't want to pay Texas twice. So there was sort of a flow down here. But exactly why? Hard to say, you know. Maybe just family called other family.
A lot of the Irish, a lot of why did a lot of the Scotch Irish, and you also don't want to forget. A number of years ago, Caroline and I took a trip to China, and we were in China with the head of the Presbyterian Church. To this very day, the head of the Presbyterian Church is part of the government of Scotland. So there was a great tradition of the church forming as the local government in the community. A lot of people they overlook the role of the union meeting houses throughout the county. There's a discussion about God's well in Westminster. And when the other wells were going dry in Westminster, but God's well did not go dry, where did the community go to meet to discuss the problem with the drought? They went to the Union Meeting House. And if you had a problem in Manchester or Hampstead or Tonytown or the other areas, when you had a community problem, you went to church to solve it. You didn't go to government, for Pete's sake. I'm not sure what government solves some things. Yes, sir.
Another reason that a lot of those German immigrants came through Philadelphia and into Pennsylvania was Pennsylvania offered a lot of religious freedom. A lot of the people come from the Palatine region of Germany were Catholic, and even though Maryland was founded as a Catholic colony, eventually it reverted to Protestantism under English rule. And so Catholics weren't always welcome in Maryland in the late 1700s. So a lot of Germans who may have also been Brethren or other sects that weren't accepted well by the English settlers tended to settle in Pennsylvania, and then, as Chris had said, turned southward. Many of them settled in Frederick County as well. At the time of the American Revolution, 40% of the population of the city of Frederick spoke German as their primary language, which is why they located the Hessian barracks there for German prisoners during the Revolution. And many of them also spilled all the way down into the Shenandoah Valley. There are a lot of German descendants living in the Shenandoah Valley for the same reason. They hit the frontier. The frontier was dangerous. It was difficult to cross the Appalachians. So they went southward because that was really the easiest direction to go in.
And when they imprisoned a lot of the Hessian soldiers in Frederick, they stayed. They stayed after the war.
Right, there were German families there,
correct,
German-speaking families, and they intermarried with those families. Right. They didn't want to go back to Germany and be reconscripted at that point and to have to serve again, so they looked around and said, this is great farmland, we can get free land, we're free, plenty of German-speaking girls here to marry, and a lot of them just stayed. Right.
We had German POWs in Carroll County during World War II. Mm-hmm. So that tradition carried. And I still find it just absolutely fascinating, speaking of traditions, the fact that the Memorial Day Parade ends at what was the Union Meeting House. I mean, still to this very day, we still go back to our very early roots. But a lot of, when you try to understand current contemporary Carroll County politics, a lot of people are just simply not aware of the extreme tension between northern Carroll County and southern Carroll County. And that's where Westminster came into play, because we were trying to make everybody happy in Westminster and failing consistently. More questions, please, because I like the questions. Yes?
Where's Lutheran Church? Who donated the land for our church?
You know, I don't know that answer. I know Caroline's family, the Babylons, donated the parking lot across the street. I do know that. I don't know that answer. And why? I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know. I bet Cindy Beckhart knows the answer.
Russ Mills, Russ.
Oh, John, the question, maybe John knows, because John knows a lot of this history. John, why was Grace Lutheran Church located here? I mean, did somebody donate? Have I read somebody that they donated the property?
It was donated, and actually they had a play. I think it was at Westminster High School. There's some people still around that were in that play.
Dorothy Elderdice wrote it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it was, I can't think of the guy's name, but yeah, he offered land, and I think it was like over a handshake, over across a fence, something like that. And that was the name of the play. And then the minister that you mentioned, Holloway, I think he coaxed him into giving him a little more land than what he'd offered originally. But it is because it was donated. I just can't think of the guy's name.
Bill Foreman would probably know.
Yeah, Bill might know.
Because he's the one I heard about, and I forgot now what it was.
Yeah, Bill might know. Bill might know. And interesting, I was introduced to a lot of this history when I was very young, because Mrs. Foreman is still, is she 1/4 or 1/2 Native American, which a lot of folks are not aware. More questions? Yes, ma'am.
This isn't a question, it's just a comment. But St. John's Lutheran Church on Leicester Church Road was donated by my ancestors, a group of brothers who had farms in the area. And that's how it became known as Leicester's Lutheran Church.
Oh, fascinating. When was it built? When was it started? Do you
I
know?
don't know.
Yeah. I would like to, I was given a history just before this presentation. If you have a history of your church, I would like to have it. I would like to have it and incorporate it. I've written about, Dave Baer has done so much research on the United Methodist Church. I've written about Strawbridge before, but I would like to continue to integrate. I've written about St. John Catholic Church in Westminster. That history is absolutely, totally fascinating. I mean, we to this day pay ground rent to the Archdiocese of Baltimore because of the history of St. John Catholic Church. This was the Grand Adam Farm. Did you ever hear the story about the Grand Adam Farm? The Grand Adam Farm, when the folks who owned the Grand Adam Farm, which farmed much of this area of the Westminster area. Remember, Westminster stopped at the railroad tracks. Westminster stopped at the railroad tracks. Where the current railroad tracks are in Westminster was a swamp. And the reason why Main Street is so straight and narrow is because it was a straight shot formed by the Native Americans to get through the swamp. It was the one high area to get through. The playground, if you ever wonder why we have the playground in Westminster where it's currently located, is because it was a swamp. And then there was the Grand Adam Farm, which was predominantly an orchard. And when the woman who owned the farm died, the farm was left to a female slave who had run the farm for years. And she, according to oral tradition, she ran the farm perfectly. But it was left in the will that if she did not run the farm really well, it would revert to the Catholic Church. She ran the farm perfectly, and as a result, it was reverted to the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church developed all of this end of town. And that's why much of this end of town pays ground rent, or is supposed to pay ground rent to this very day. And that gave the church the money to build the church. 1867? Yeah. Yeah, there it is in the center. Caroline, can you, yeah, right there. That's St. John Catholic Church, and that's the cemetery. But Caroline, you go above it. There was a place in Westminster. It was actually called the Space Between, and much of the space between was the Grand Adam Farm, all the way up to Grace Lutheran Church. Grace Lutheran Church to this day should pay ground rent. Ground rent, I'm not sure of the status of ground rent. I remember when the fire company, Smith and Reif-Snyder Lumber Company, paid ground rent, and when the fire company wanted to relocate to the Smith and Reif-Snyder lumber yard, I said to some of the board of directors, well, what are you going to do about the ground rent? And they kind of looked at me like, what's this old guy talking about anyway? The fire company actually paid off the ground rent, which you can do. You can buy out the ground rent these days. I don't know what Grace Lutheran Church has done with it.
Come get us.
But yeah, that just beyond St. John, where the railroad tracks are currently located, they drained a swamp to put the railroad through. In June 15th, 1861 is when the railroad came through. So what do I focus on next? This is one of my favorite topics. We should probably have the history of Methodism, but actually Dave Bear would be best for that too. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dave would do an excellent job with that. I usually refer all my questions to that. And any other topics too. I would love to hear. I've gotten a lot of topics for my articles. I've written 2,500 articles on history for the Baltimore Sun. But I'm always looking for ideas. So if you have any ideas or any additional questions, I'll hang around for a while. Yes, ma'am?
I'm still trying to find out how the Wakefield Valley came into being.
And I still don't know that answer. Come
on, get working.
But I came close to it one day. But I did come close to it one day.
Yeah.
What was the question?
Yeah, because that it's all hooked up with Lee Masters.
What was the question?
The question is why, how did the Wakefield Valley get its name Wakefield Valley? And it's tied up a little bit with Lee Master of sorts. And Lee Master, every Halloween, they pull out these stories about Lee Master. And Dr. Jesse Glass wrote the definitive work that Lee Masters probably didn't do any of that stuff. He was a royalist during the Revolutionary War, and after the war, he was maligned by folks who were upset because he supported the English. The American Revolution was only supported by about 25% of the American population, and it was supported by about 25% of the English population. I'm not sure who said. I studied the American Revolution from the English point of view when I was in college. It is a fascinatingly, totally different war. It is, but Lee Master, I'll look it up again. I'll take it.
There was a creamery. There was a creamery sometime in the late 1800s named Wakefield. I also know that in England there is a Wakefield that had a lot of business. I don't know what it was exactly, but anyone who was English and came here from that area might have said, oh, this is just like home. Let's call it Wakefield.
I'd often heard that's why a lot of the Germans came here too, but if you spend time in England, close your eyes, Carroll County is just like England, and it's just like large portions of Germany also. but Wakefield Valley. And you know, the other interesting thing about Wakefield Valley is some of the best farmland in Carroll County, and it's now all been developed. A lot of folks get excited out in the Wakefield Valley area when developments are being brought forward, but nobody remembers when the first development came through. I mean, the folks came with pitchforks and torches because they were developing some of the prime farmland in Carroll County.
There's a Wakefield Valley Road that runs from New Windsor, the old New Windsor Turnpike, that goes all the way up to Strawbridge, that area.
Right.
So maybe it had something to do with Methodist.
Lydia, are you going to throw me off the stage?
Don't
Because
go.
I would, and I got to tell you, I love this stuff as long as folks would ask questions. I love you guys. Thank you. This was really exciting. Thank you.
Kevin, thank you so much. You are always, it's always fabulous to hear your wonderful stories in the community. A couple of things. We have several events coming up. Diana Scott, of course, a very knowledgeable local historian and author, and just asking about Wakefield, will be our speaker for the annual birthday party. Carroll County is celebrating its 185th birthday, and our event will be on Saturday, January 15th. We're planning to have it here. I hope you can join us, and also that day we're going to have a thank you celebration for Chris McMasters for her tremendous efforts to keep everything rolling during the last difficult 2 years. So Diana Scott's book, Forgotten Corner, History of Oakland Mills, is the subject of our annual birthday talk. So thank you, Diana. On January 18th, we have Libby Foose, who's written a wonderful, wonderful book about her father's letters home during World War II. And she will be here talking about A Faithful Soldier Writes Home. On February 15th, Mimi Ashcraft, back by popular demand, will be talking about African American grave carvers. And we will have our virtual winter wine tasting with the incredibly knowledgeable and interesting Bernie Vogel at Jeannie Bird on February 26th. And I apologize to you all because I have never met Jason until this very moment. So I didn't really have much to say except welcome. So Jason, I'm going to ask you if you wouldn't mind sharing a few words about how lucky we are to have you and what you've been doing. So thank you.
Not to put you on the spot or anything.
And by the way, Kevin, I was amazed that it was the route and not the churches that made Westminster on the straight and narrow, huh?
Thank you, Kevin, again, for a great presentation. It's good for me to try to absorb as much of this history as I can, even though, interestingly, I was born in Westminster on Main Street. Some of you know that story. Not too far from the college. When I was about 2 or 3, my family moved to Baltimore County. And then life and work and everything else took me in all other directions, different states, and now, 44 years later, I'm back in Westminster, which has kind of gone full circle. But I also wanted to mention, you notice Chris has that wonderful stand there, and if you think someone would like to see these presentations, have them check out, of course, first the Facebook Live viewing of the talks, but we also post these on YouTube. Of course, I think you give us permission to share it out. So I'd love to talk to you more about the Historical Society and where we're headed. Our next strategic plan is we're going to be starting conversations about that, and we have all kinds of ideas and hopes for the society. But send me an email, give me a call, and let's chat about the future of the Historical Society. Some of you read a little bit about my background. I've worked in museums and public history settings since graduate school. I actually have a love for history. I have a bachelor's degree in history, but my graduate work was in museum studies. So my focus really is strategic planning, fundraising, and that sort of administrative stuff for museums and historical societies. it kind of gets me going. But I do have a history bone in my body. I love it, and I want to be an advocate for our county's history. And I'd love to hear from you. And thank you again for warmly welcoming me into this community again.